land rose here, emerging from the sea a few grains of sand at a time. Slowly it began to stretch a thin finger far out into the water. Sandy Point. Ages passed, and Sandbars became an island, covered in grasses and flowers with wild fruit hidden amongst them. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 had given France control of the region. Despite this, near the end of the 18th century, English-speaking Europeans began to settle on the island. Under the leadership of Philippe Meservey, the settlers, who were mostly from the Channel Islands, soon established a thriving community. Sandy Point became the commercial center for the entire west coast of Newfoundland.
We had no worry on Sandy Point for children, because the only worry you had was the horses. There was no scare of going to get hit by a car or something like that. They could enjoy themselves. In the evenings, the horses that come down, you had to be careful then.
That was the kind of freedom that existed over there, to be able to roam the whole island anywhere you want, from the woods to the wards. Sandy Point was sort of split in two communities. One was called Down Lawn, the other one was called Up Lawn. And mostly in the Down Lawn were the Protestant families, and the Up Lawn were the Catholic families. And there wasn't, back in those days, there wasn't a lot of intermixing between the two religions. There was a lot of prejudice existed between both religions, and each group pretty much kept to themselves.
French Indians lived up that way. That's what they called them at that time. They didn't call themselves Indians, but they were French. They spoke French and they were Indian. Micmac descent and everything else, eh?
What we've discovered that from the very first visitation, or the very first known visitation of European visitors, the Mi'kmaq people were recorded as living throughout the entire Bay St. George area. We've not been able to find any record of any animosities or disturbances or ill relationships. When the Europeans came to Sandy Point and they settled at Sandy Point, and the French already being here, they realized at that particular point in time is that the survival was very important on relationship. The entire circle of the bay from Indian Head, and Indian Head was not named by accident, but from Indian Head right on through to what is now the community of Flat Bay, was a very extensive used area with many Aboriginal people, many Mi'kmaq people living in those very locations. The one thing that we have to remember is that when we look at historical documentation and we talk about Bay St. George Mi'kmaq and we talk about the Flat Bay connection, Flat Bay back in the 1800s was not a community. The designated community came in later years when the Europeans moved into all of these other locations that were one time occupied by the Mi'kmaq people, and Mi'kmaq people started to desert these areas.
The memory I have is when the men of war that to come in and we would go to the dances. Well, I was 17 then when I was let go to the dances. Can you remember your grandmother? When the ships would come in, they would bring the band and show, and 12 o'clock they had to go back. And she would play the piano then for 2. And her and Rex McSurvey, Rex was to play the banjo and she was to play the piano.
We had a garden around, a picket fence garden around our house that contained me until I made a friendship with my older cousin, Robbie McSurvey. And Robbie would come along, he'd open the gate and let me out. So I'd go frolicking along behind him. Half the time my parents not even knowing I was gone out of the garden. I remember my mother telling me that I was brought home one day, and I guess that's even before my earliest recollection, so I was probably only about 3 or 4 years of age. But I had been found wandering down somewhere around near the Government Wharf, which is quite a distance away from our house, and I was brought home by this person who knew I had to be Morgan's child because my nose looked just like my father's. As I grew a bit older and then started to tag along behind my dad down to his fishing store, and I had the freedom down around there of going out in the wharf, catching a flatfish, catching a sculpin, getting out my father's dory. When I got old enough, I was allowed to take the dory out and roll the dory around, and I was probably about 7 years old before I was able to do that, just to be able to handle the oars.
Sandy Point was pretty good. Like when I was 5, 6, 7 or 8 years old, we used to go over sometime in the 40s. Oh, it was very interesting for us guys. There was no stores in St. George's much, just a few things, eh? But they sold everything over there, over in the stores in Sandy Point. When we were going to school, we used to go to Sandy Point, skate, cross back and forth there all the time. Every year, just about, the harbour used to freeze over and we'd skate from home after school and go over to Sandy Point and skate back before supper. You know, it was nothing to it. And we also, everybody we used to make an ice boat at the time, and we used to take ice boats and go over. When the wind was favourable, you'd jump on and go over to Sandy Point in 2 or 3 minutes.